I'm Nathaniel Bozarth, and this is Wide Ruled, Brand New's podcast on the past and present of equality in education. On today's episode, we continue our trilogy on education issues in rural Iowa. Specifically, we tackle something to which we've alluded in previous episodes, district consolidation, also called reorganization. But first, in order to keep producing Wide Ruled, we are looking for sponsorships. You can help by going to patreon.com/Wide Ruled Podcast and pledging as little as $2 per month. Your support helps us get the word out to a broader audience and become financially sustainable. Now, here's our first guest.
My name is Joe Kramer, Superintendent, Pocahontas Area Community School District.
Those barometers? Oh no, that's a clock.
Clock, and then I think the other one is relative humidity, maybe.
It's a thermometer.
Yep, thermometer. Tell you how often I look at it.
Thank you.
It's great.
Pocahontas School District was founded in 1875. The school district actually became incorporated in 1952. In 1989, the consolidation with Havelock Plover took place and became Pocahontas Community School District at that point in time. So the name community was added at that reorganization. A few years later, in 1993, Pocahontas consolidated with Rolfe School District and became Pocahontas Area at that point in time. Mm-hmm. In 2012, we had our third reorganization, and that was with the Palmer School District. And then we began middle school athletics sharing with Lorenz Marathon the following year in 2013 already. And since that time, we've moved from middle school athletic sharing to high school athletic sharing. This year we had partial day sharing, so their high school students came over for just the end of the day for electives that they were no longer able to provide there. Mm-hmm. Next year will be the first year that their students will be here all day long for grades 9 through 12.
Okay, that was a lot of history condensed into a few short sentences, I know. And you're not alone if all that language didn't quite make sense. It'll become more clear as we continue. But what you need to understand now is that since its founding, the school district serving the city of Pocahontas, the seat of Pocahontas County, has gradually and continually annexed the surrounding school districts. But why?
When you've got declining enrollment, tight budgets at the state level, the end result oftentimes is consolidation. The local school board here, their priority has been to the best of their ability, be able to continue to maintain the highest quality of programming possible, preferably not giving up anything that they have traditionally been able to do. Well, when you've got declining enrollment, that means either one of two things. Either you have to figure out a way to increase your enrollment, or you need to partner with neighbors in order to be able to continue offering the same types of opportunities to your students that you've been able to in the past. If you're the smaller district in that process, it's a little bit harder. When you look at reorganizations, at least for this area, almost every school district has already gone through at least one round. So when you look at Lorenz Marathon, they've already reorganized. Palmer, one of the last districts we consolidated with, had previously had a reorganization. So it's not uncommon for two smaller districts to have first combined, and then it continues to expand from there when they can no longer easily meet the needs of the students based on the budget constraints.
Mm-hmm. So, and like the whole reason we have Palmer is because it's those are two different towns.
Correct. Who had merged together. It were originally two school districts, one in Pomeroy, one in Palmer,
right,
who eventually merged into Palmer, who then later merged with Pocahontas Area.
Outlining that again, Pomeroy and Palmer are two separate towns in north central Iowa. They had taken the Our Forces Combined approach in order to best serve their students, forming the Pomeroy-Palmer School District in 1990. But water was still coming into the boat. They were still sinking.
The enrollment was dropping. I mean, they were down sitting just over probably 200 students, K through 12. So they had some elementary classes that were in single digits already. So they did their shopping and eventually came back, and we started with the athletic sharing first with Palmer.
So you keep it straight. When he says we, he means the Pocahontas Community School District.
And we started with the athletic sharing first with Palmer, then went to whole grade sharing, and eventually that led to the very rapid movement into a consolidation vote. I had to notify the board July 1, and by February 1st of that year, we had the public meetings, brought the community on board as best as we could, and actually had a community-wide consolidation vote in both districts to determine whether or not to consolidate with each other. And that happened on the 1st of February.
So you mean like the residents, like everyone
Yes.
gets to vote on that?
When you're talking about consolidation, that is a community-wide vote. So all of your eligible voters have a voice in terms of what that looks like and what happens there. When you're talking about just sharing athletics or sharing of classes, the school board can make those decisions. But when you're talking about consolidation, that requires a community-wide vote for that to go through.
And that brings us to another story happening in a very different part of the country. In this case, the community had a voice through public forums and things, but no purely democratic vote took place as it was in the case of Palmer and Pocahontas, Iowa, because consolidation was happening within a single district as opposed to inter-district. I'm talking about something that happened in Kansas City in 2010.
You haven't seen these?
Tell me what we're looking at.
Okay, so these are the right-sizing scorecards.
This is Mary Esselman, President and CEO of Operation Breakthrough. You'll hear more about Operation Breakthrough in a future episode. Mary was Assistant Superintendent of Kansas City, Missouri School District in 2010 during the proceedings for Superintendent Dr. Covington's right-sizing plan.
Initially, there was a round of community forums that took place at various locations in the city. You know, one of the things that came forth really loud and clear was the fact that people just didn't want it to be one metric, like lowest performing schools. And so what we did is we said, all right, we're going to develop these scorecards that really combine a variety of factors. So, oh, sorry, I hit the wrong button. So this is Central High School. So you can see every single school.
So we're looking at Northeast High School.
Yeah. So this one is Central High School. Here's one for East. So every school had one, and then when you finally got to the rankings, you could see, you know, how many reds did you have, how many yellows, you know, how many greens, and then how many blues. And so then after this phase, then we went out into these were made into big posters, and then we went out and had regional forums. And then at that point, in addition to this information, there were enrollment projections that were done using census data as well as district data, so they could actually project over time what percentage of kids were actually still living in those neighborhoods. And that data was used along with this data to then look at capacity of the schools and how many seats were needed and how many seats really needed to be closed.
Things like building condition, capacity versus actual usage, and proximity to other buildings were considered on the scorecards. Ultimately, the purpose of the plan was to cut unnecessary building costs, as the district was serving about a quarter as many students as when it had reached peak student enrollment back in the late 60s. The right-sizing plan would become one of the first extensive urban school district consolidations. 28 buildings would be closed by fall of 2010, nearly half of the district's buildings. What put Kansas City, Missouri School District in this situation?
Well, I think what you saw at that time is you had a case where there was incredible amount of capacity that wasn't being used. And so you had schools, especially at the secondary level, where, you know, they were potentially using less than 50% of the capacity. And if you looked historically at the school closure patterns, there was the intent, but there was never kind of the ability to actually close as many that needed to be closed. So there might be one or two closed here or there, but there had never been kind of a full-scale look at capacity and then budget. Because you got to remember, if you're not using, your entire building, you're still there's a cost of running a school. The district was also at a point in time where they were spending more each year than they were actually taking in terms of revenue. So you were having to go into the reserve. And there were other critical programs in terms of performance that were needed, early childhood, other things that there were no funds available for.
I'll add that white and black flight in the 60s and thereafter contributed largely to the district's falling enrollment numbers. And so did the more than a dozen charter schools that had opened their doors since 1999.
You said that there were kind of some piecemeal closings where there was one or two that were closed. Why were more schools not closed when they needed to be early on?
Well, you can see it not just in Kansas City, you can see it across the country, you can see it across the straight line that schools are very personal. For many, that's their alma mater. And so, or that's where kids are going, and that's where, tradition is for many families. And so to be able to say we're going to close the school is really, really hard. And so I think that sometimes it results in bowing to public sentiment. And I think what made this so significant is it was presented in a resolution to the board as all or nothing. You either do it all or you don't do it. And so I think it made it different from in the past where, for lack of a better word, it was sometimes more of a cherry picking. You picked from the list that was recommended as opposed to looking at kind of this whole series of objective data and then make the recommendation. I will say that once the presentation was made of the data, then residents of each region were able to get up and make comments and talk. So there were multiple phases too where the community could come in and give input.
If it's difficult for people in the city to give up a school, it's even more difficult for folks in rural places. There, in towns where there aren't major art fairs, where there maybe isn't a movie theater or a night scene, or public parks with nice views for picnics or more than one or two restaurants to go out for dinner, the school and the events surrounding the school become the principal social hub for the community. And it makes sense that you wouldn't want it to go away.
We had one challenging reorganization, that was with Havelock Plover School District. It got very heated. And in fact, during one of the joint board meetings when they were negotiating and talking through this process of consolidation, one community member got so frustrated and stood up and said, "I'm sick and tired of hearing what is best for kids. We want to keep our school." That's emotion talking. And sometimes in the heat of emotion, logic starts being pushed away. They typically don't go hand in hand. The Palmer School Board had in their boardroom a plaque on the wall that they kind of religiously referred to. And the plaque read on the wall next in the boardroom is the decision we're about to make in the best interest of kids. And they used that as kind of their grounding in terms of making decisions. And I think it made a difference for them to make some of those harder decisions because that was the culture. Is the decision we're about to make in the best interest of our kids.
So why would it be in the best interest of our kids to consolidate schools? What are kids losing in rural Iowa if a community resists district reorganization?
Well, I'll use an example of one of the districts that we've worked with in the past. You had individuals within the community who were very much wanting to keep that local community school alive. At the same time, their enrollment was declining. So in that particular district, the challenge became they didn't want to reorganize because their high school numbers were still fairly strong, but their elementary through middle school numbers had already taken a dive. Statistically in Iowa, it costs about 75% of the per pupil allocation to educate an elementary student. It takes about 100% of the per pupil allocation to educate a middle school student, and it takes almost 125% of the state's per pupil allocation to educate high school students. So if your elementary erodes down, you no longer have the money to keep functioning at the secondary level. So at some point, you have to start reducing staff because of this loss of funds that are coming in. That usually starts with the cutting of programs and course offerings for your high school students. They start moving toward basically the bare minimum to meet accreditation standards. For example, we've got some school districts in the past when I first came here who were not offering any dual credit college course offerings to their high school students, while schools around them were offering 20 and 30 classes to pick from that were college credit courses. So then you start getting into an equity issue in terms of your students in the smaller district that's perhaps struggling, not having the same opportunities as the neighbor down the road.
Mm-hmm. And you'll remember from the previous episode, Pocahontas Area High School principal Roger Francis talking about how even Pocahontas, who has taken on all these surrounding districts, still has to make considerations in the diversity of their course offerings to ensure they maintain full accreditation in the eyes of the state. So I had to ask, how long can this go on?
Under the current laws, it's going to be difficult for it to go a lot further. Pocahontas area, as I said, was 387 square miles, is already a large geography. That's less than 2 students per square mile for our school district. You then combine the fact that we're now athletic sharing and whole grade sharing with the neighbors Lorenz Marathon next door. Mm-hmm. You add in their geography, and the total square miles is now 525 square miles. So that's a large region that you're pulling students in from. They already have a fairly high percentage of the students on the western edge of their district who open enroll out to Sioux Central School District. So as a result, some of those families are already choosing what direction they're ultimately probably going to go by the decision of open enrolling their students to a different school district than the one they reside within.
Wow.
The easy reorganizations are done for the most part across the state. The ones that happen next start becoming more difficult to look at because the geography isn't as easy to marry together.
Right. Basically, those buses don't drive themselves and gas is not free.
It becomes more of a challenge as the geography increases, with our school district having 387 square miles now. In the state of Iowa, you have K through 8 have to be able, from the time they first get on the bus to the time they get to their attendance center, is 60 minutes. That's the maximum they can ride a bus. It goes to 70 minutes for grades 9 through 12, which, when you're dealing with small numbers, is really a moot point because I've got anywhere from K through 12 on a single bus at any one time. So we've got some students who potentially could be on a bus 2 hours out of their day just to access education.
Test. Are we... Phantom power here.
Right, it had a really nice squeak when you...
I'm Jeff Hansen with Pocahontas Community Schools. I'm the transportation director. We run, kids so rural that our buses aren't always full, but yet trying to get them home is quite a challenge sometimes. We take kids home after, like, sporting events. So after an away game, we will take them home back to their surrounding community. So drop them not off doorstep, but at a community center for picking them up from there.
I'm really hard to hear. I ask, is that normal, say, if you're in a big city?
No. I was in Fort Dodge for quite a while before I came here, and that wasn't offered there either. I mean, it's because we're so rural. If some of those kids, if they weren't offered a shuttle, they wouldn't be able to go out for that sport.
So the fact that there is after-practice bus service at all is an added expense in rural Iowa. In moderately sized or larger cities, parents would have to pick up students from school after practice if the students weren't driving themselves.
Bigger than when you were in school, isn't
Yeah,
it?
we've added a bit.
My youngest son was in Chris's class, and then my oldest son was...
This is one of the bus drivers here. She's been driving for Pocahontas School since 1980, and as a side note, said she's one of the younger drivers.
Right there.
Quarter 90, boom. Oh, yeah, there we are. That's my pa.
That's where I grew up. And they spelled the name wrong. What? Yeah, it's G-E-A-N.
Wait, are those
Yep. Tim Cook.
student names written on there?
No.
They're
no.
parent names, family names, I guess.
Yeah.
We're looking at a huge map that has the whole Pocahontas area community district on
See
it.
how the
What I was trying to say is that it's a map of the school bus routes.
Things have been added, sort of. There's a bunch of pins on it, and those are actual, like, house name.
The pins are where our stops are.
The pins are stops, but then, like, what's written are family names.
Yes.
Jeff jumps in here to explain some of the routes that look more serpentine.
Well, so here's what I said. This is one of those ones. This stop has actually been on this route in the past. It's been on this route in the past. But right now, this route is so big, I got that time factor to work with. I have to take it off of this route. This route used to be just from Highway 3 south, so it was on this route. Well, then we had some move in up here. So now his route is longer.
You get the idea.
Get over that
It changes all the time, and with every district reorganization or family relocation. What's kind of crazy is that because the district is already strapped for money, they can't afford the routing software that would make Jeff's job so much simpler. So he's using Google Maps and things like that to reconfigure routes by hand. Here's Superintendent Kramer again on how transportation costs impact the district.
General fund is taking care of your staff costs, supplies, those operating type costs. It's also the same pot of money that transportation is paid for out of. As a result of that, as school districts consolidate, the geography expands. Thus, time on the bus and the cost to bring students in also goes up. Just compared to the state average, it cost me $275 above just the state operating costs on an average to get my kids from their home into school and back home again. $275 per student that is enrolled here just to be average. So that equates to about $190,000 that could go toward additional staff that instead is going toward covering transportation costs just to get to average. That's not the total transportation cost. That's just to be average. You know, when you figure 190,000, that's about 4.5% fewer teachers just because of the transportation costs to get to average. The landscape has changed a lot over the years. We are less rural and more urban in the Midwest. We don't have the number of family farms that we used to have. They're becoming the larger farms. So instead of a farmhouse every quarter mile, those days are gone where we've got, the large families. You hate to see those losses. I guess for me professionally, I have to stay focused on what's best for kids because I'm their advocate. That's my job, is to do a budget, try to hire staff that provide the students with the highest quality of educational opportunities as possible.
An urban, suburban kid myself, I've enjoyed learning how a handful of towns in north central Iowa are addressing the challenges that tight budgets and shrinking population have wrought. And I've attempted to show how rural and urban students sometimes face similar challenges. In both cases, this is an issue of equity. All kids, regardless of where they grow up, the color of their skin, their level of ability, ought to have equitable opportunities for success. The education system is pivotal in making this happen. If you haven't gotten a chance to listen to the previous two episodes, it's episode 9 and 10, I recommend it. Both give additional takes on things happening in the wee towns surrounding Pocahontas, Iowa. I'm Nathaniel Bozarth, and this has been Wide Ruled, Brain Roots podcast on the past and present of equality in education. At the beginning of this episode, you heard Christopher Cook, native of Pocahontas, Iowa, and executive producer of this podcast. If you feel like this story was important towards greater awareness of equity issues in education, please do any or all of the following. Like us on Facebook, rate us on iTunes, leave a review on iTunes, share this podcast with a friend, and or pledge your support on Patreon. That's Patreon, N as in Nancy, /Wide Ruled Podcast. Our website It's brainroot.tv/wide-ruled podcast. Thanks for listening.